Hello, I'm John Pelley and welcome to this pre-conference video that introduces the IAMC 2016 workshop on active learning. This workshop will be held on June 4th in Leiden, and since I cannot attend the conference in person this year, I've been asked to assist Alice Ferneri, Ann Pazanski, and John Zarek by bringing a perspective on metacognition, which we plan to teleconference during the workshop. What I hope to provide here is intended to supplement my portion of the workshop. So let's start with clarifying what metacognition is and why it is an important concept for you to consider while you're attending this workshop. Since the term meta is a self-reference, the term metacognition refers to thinking about cognition or thinking about thinking. I will bring a focus in this introduction on how active learning can foster metacognition. The most immediate relevance of metacognition is that it is absolutely required for self-directed learning. Since there is no reasonable way to select for self-directed learning skills in our applicants, we need to help teach students to become self-directed learners. This creates a dilemma in that since we create these experiences, it tends to make them teacher-directed and not self-directed. My argument is that we can use our active learning experiences to guide self-directed learning. The reason that metacognition is required for self-directed learning is that because it produces a self-assessment for students when they examine their own thinking. This self-assessment is not the same as the diagnostic testing that reveals to the student what they need to learn. Instead, it's an assessment of how they are thinking. And I'll illustrate this by emphasizing how all students have both strengths and gaps in their learning through the example of learning style. That means that we can use the active learning experiences, such as those covered in this workshop, to help students develop this self-assessment. But first, let's continue to dissect my metaphoric video title and then consider what I mean by a bridge. The one experience that changed the course of my career was the revelation that students process information in two primarily different ways, and that this often results in a significant misunderstanding between them and their teachers. As the academic affairs dean, I had been struggling to find ways to help at-risk students recover their academic standing. But the frustration mounted when nothing that I could suggest helped their performance. It only made the problem more enigmatic when it would become clear from talking to the student that they were intelligent enough and they seemed to know the material. But I came to realize that one type of learning style made the student vulnerable on our examinations. This learning style aimed at straight memorization, and it suggested to me that I needed to teach those students the learning strategies of the successful learning style. This successful learning style was the integrative or big picture learning, and I had taught the memorization learners how to develop the skill of finding patterns and relationships by constructing concept maps of what they were reading. The exciting outcome was that once I taught the students about their thinking, and then I taught them how to process information differently, it created a communications bridge between us that allowed continuing teaching and skill development. The concept of learning skill took on a brand new meaning for me. This bridge of communication with the student allowed me to help address the issue of how to learn in addition to what to learn. Let's now take a look at the last metaphor in my title, The Troubled Waters. The troubled waters represents the struggle we all face in transforming the student from a teacher-directed mode of learning to a self-directed mode. We all enter teaching thinking about the what, and only when we are confronted with a problem do we think about the how. I think it's just human nature for us to assume everyone learns the way we do. The transformation to self-directed learning can also be stated as a transformation from a receiver of information to a producer of understanding. And as understanding accumulates, the student is better able to recognize what further learning is needed. Our frustration is that any activity that we design is by definition teacher-directed. Even when students are learning independently, they are still guided by objectives and syllabi that we create. I have found the only way to address this problem is to create mindful learners. We need strategies that help teach the students an awareness of how they learn, and I'm recommending that we accomplish this by teaching them about how their learning style influences their learning. To do this, we have to also acquire this same awareness of ourselves. So in the next slide, I'll help you apply learning style to yourselves. To begin with, there are many derivations of learning style, most of which have only face validity. That is, they sound reasonable. But my own experience has been that I have found all but one learning style to be of limited utility in medical education. And that learning style is the one described by the Jungian sensing and intuitive personality types. These personality types are identified by the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and they're described in my free online book located at the website listed at the end of this video. Before describing the specifics of the sensing and intuitive types, we need to briefly consider the general features of personality type, and especially to distinguish the terms type and trait. This is because there is published criticism of the MBTI that can lead to uncertainty in some teachers about whether it is reliable and valid. You will find that the criticisms of Jungian type can be traced to a naivete concerning what a type is. More succinctly put, type is a sorting concept. By comparison, trait is a measuring concept. Thus, a type is either or, and a trait is how much. When trait is misapplied to the Myers-Briggs, the statistics completely break down and the critics actually sound intelligent. So now that we have clarified that we are only sorting the way people think, let's look at what the MBTI sorts out. First, it sorts out normal differences between the way people think and that is how they perceive the world and how they make decisions from these perceptions. Second, these preferences are persistent because they represent the easiest way for us to think. They are also unconscious in the same way that you unconsciously fold your arms the same way every time. Third, we override these preferences whenever needed, but it takes a conscious effort and a need to do so. This conscious effort provides increased awareness, and when we apply it to our learning, it makes us mindful of our own thinking. Fourth, these preferences do not change over time, although your certainty of what you prefer may become clearer over time. Fifth, your type can be understood as a comfort zone for thinking because it requires the least effort. Your type describes your general behavior because you tend to use the preference that's easiest. And sixth, It is normal for everyone to use both learning styles and still prefer only one, the one in their comfort zone. Now, let's get more specific about exactly what the choices are during learning and how they affect learning. Here we can visualize the comfort zone of two types of learners. The linear learner is my term for the Jungian sensing type. The concept map that represents their thinking looks like an ordinary list enclosed in bubbles. When these students begin learning how to construct concept maps, they produce linear maps that are nearly identical to the one shown here. But it is important to know that any student of this learning style can learn how to produce maps like the one on the right by following just a few different steps in their reading. When they do this, their examination grades go up. On the right, we see the integrative learner, which is my term for the Jungian intuitive type. These students are often impatient with constructing concept maps because they see them instinctively by the jumping around way that they read. It is tempting until you learn the full story to consider the linear learners as less intelligent and superficial. Time doesn't permit a complete explanation here, but suffice it to say that intelligence is not a factor as much as mental habit is a factor, and mental habit can be changed by teaching and practice. The overriding concept here is that health professionals need to develop both types of thinking skill regardless of which one they prefer. The active learning methods you will be learning in this workshop will automatically develop both skills in all students, but it's important to make the students aware of this. Now, let's look at the implications for these learning styles by how they affect the student's thinking when taking tests. As you can see, the sensing students are much less prepared for questions that require higher order thinking skills. They actually do learn from their study, but that learning is limited to remembering and not understanding. They are receivers that need to transform into producers. The intuitive students, by comparison, are able to eliminate wrong answers by an instinctive feel for how well the answer fits the patterns or big picture that they have learned. They can literally choose the correct answer without having learned it, as long as they have learned all of the incorrect answers. So, with this brief introduction to learning style, you now have a basis to think about your thinking. Let's consider how you can get now the most out of this workshop. Like many conference attendees, one of the outcomes that you seek for this workshop is learning how to implement some active learning modalities in your teaching program. And it goes hand in hand to look for some tips and tricks that will help the implementation go more smoothly. There is one more thing you can learn, however, and that is, how were you thinking during the exercises? Were you focused in sensing type mode primarily on what to do and how to do the process correctly? Or did you think in intuitive type mode about why the active learning exercise might be needed? Were you able also to keep your awareness on what decisions you would have to make if you were a student? Decisions tend to reveal the learning style, since the way you explain yourself is a decision. How would a student with a learning preference opposite to yours be expressing themselves? Thinking about these questions in advance will help make you mindful during the workshop, and mindful learning leads to self-directed learning. Now, let's consider some self-awareness questions for you to consider at the end of the workshop. First, if you have sensing preferences, you will pay more attention to how to do things and what to do, and less attention to why you're doing it. Then the reverse would be true for the intuitives. So it will help you to understand your students if you keep in mind that both the sensing and intuitive types neglect part of their thinking unless they become mindful learners. So which type of thinking was easiest for you? Second, understanding your own preference is equal in importance to understanding that of your opposite, and the same is true for your students. I will try to address any clarifications or concerns about this during my Skype Q&A time at the end of the workshop. Third, you will notice that every action in active learning comes from a decision. Even when providing memorized knowledge, the decision has been made to recite what has been memorized. Were you able to recognize the variety of types of decisions that were needed in each exercise? It was probably a little of both. Fourth, when you return home to implement what you have learned in this workshop, you will want to instill in your students an awareness of how they are thinking and how others are thinking. Can you identify in each modality in this workshop how that awareness would help them learn to teach themselves, that is, to become self-directed? If you want some helpful materials so that you can get the most out of the workshop, here are some suggestions on the next slide. The IAMC manual on active learning is available at the IAMC website, and each of the workshop exercises is described there so you can read about them in advance. And for more on metacognition, check out the Expert Skills program linked at the web address listed. I look forward to talking with you at the end of the workshop, and I hope you have a safe and enjoyable trip.